My name is Dr. James Lancaster. I am 42 years old, an astrophysicist, and a specialist in interstellar communication. It has been 4 months since we received that signal. The last gasp of a ship that should have been dead for decades. The Voyager. And now, as I try to write this, I realize the words don't flow as they once did. There's something wrong with me. My memory falters. My mind trips over itself as if trying to escape something I can't name. But I remember the beginning. It all started with a sound. I was in the NASA control room, surrounded by screens blinking with streams of data and monitors displaying star maps. It was an ordinary day, or at least it was supposed to be. We were monitoring radio signals from deep space, a routine task for us when it came. A faint, distorted signal, almost like static. It could have gone unnoticed, except for one detail. It came from Voyager 1, a spacecraft that lost contact with Earth over 50 years ago. At first, we were excited. After all, receiving any kind of transmission from such an ancient probe was a monumental achievement. But as we began analyzing the data, something seemed off. The signal wasn't just fragmented. It contained strange patterns, as if deliberately encoded. Some colleagues thought it might be cosmic interference, but something inside me knew it wasn't that. It was something bigger, more sinister. "James," said Sarah Chen, our head of cryptography, "you look like you've seen a ghost." She was standing next to me, staring at the screen where numbers blinked. "Do you really think this is important?" I didn't answer immediately. My eyes were fixed on the numbers. There was something about them that deeply unsettled me, something I couldn't quite identify. It was like hearing an unfamiliar song but feeling as though I had heard it before. A sense of déjà vu that made no sense. "I don't know," I murmured finally. "But this doesn't feel natural," she scoffed, clearly irritated by my evasive response. "Natural? You're starting to sound like one of those conspiracy theorists who always say we're being watched." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was projecting my own paranoia onto the signal. But something kept me there, in that room, studying those numbers late into the night, even after everyone else had left. I needed to understand. It was during one of those nights that it happened. I was alone, sitting in front of the screen, when something changed. The numbers began to move differently, as if they were alive. My peripheral vision caught a flicker, or maybe it was just fatigue. I don't know. But when I looked back at the screen, I noticed something no one else had. The numbers weren't random. They formed layers, like folded sheets stacked on top of each other. And beneath them, there was another message. My hands trembled as I frantically typed on the keyboard, decoding the underlying pattern. Each new line of text that appeared on the screen made me more anxious. When the final translation emerged, I felt my heart stop. "Voyager has found home. You will be next." The words blinked on the screen for a few seconds before disappearing completely. I looked around the empty room, half expecting someone to walk in and tell me it was a joke. But there was no one. I was alone, with it. In the days that followed, I tried to tell others what I had discovered, but no one believed me. "It's just noise," they said. "You're exhausted, James. You need a break." But I knew it wasn't noise. It was real. And worst of all, I could feel something growing inside me, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the signal itself was seeping into my mind, whispering things I didn't want to hear. From that moment on, everything began to change. The machines in the control room started experiencing inexplicable malfunctions. The communication systems emitted strange sounds, like distant voices. And then one night, as I reviewed the data again, I heard something that froze my blood. A voice. It wasn't mine, nor anyone I knew. It was low, guttural, almost like an echo from far away. "We are here," it said, "waiting." I looked around, but the room was empty. I knew I should leave, go home, sleep. But I couldn't. Something held me, to that chair, to that screen, to those words, and that's when I realized the signal wasn't just a message. It was a key, and we, unknowingly, had already turned the lock. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen after the message appeared. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, as if afraid to touch anything. The room felt colder than usual, though I knew it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Or so I told myself. The others eventually noticed my silence. Sarah Chen walked over, her sharp eyes narrowing as she glanced at my monitor. "What is it now, Lancaster?" Her voice was clipped, impatient, but there was an edge of unease beneath her words. She had always been the pragmatic one, the one who refused to entertain wild theories or superstitions. But even she couldn't ignore the tension that had settled over the room like a suffocating fog. I think we've made a mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy, as if saying them aloud would make them more real. "This signal, it's not just noise. It's a warning." Chen sighed, running a hand through her short-cropped hair. "James, we've been over this. It's probably just interference or some glitch in the system. You're reading too much into it." But I wasn't. I could feel it in my bones, a gnawing certainty that something was terribly wrong. The numbers on the screen weren't random. They formed patterns, layers upon layers of meaning that defied logic. And now, with the translated message staring back at me, "Voyager has crashed on our home and we know you." I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. No, not watched. Studied. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Debates erupted in the control room, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a shore. Some argued that the signal was proof of intelligent life beyond Earth, a discovery that could redefine humanity's place in the universe. Others dismissed it as nonsense, a cruel trick played by cosmic chance. But deep down, I think we all felt it. The creeping dread that whatever had sent this message wasn't interested in peaceful contact. Commander Chen finally broke the stalemate. "We need to investigate," she declared, slamming her fist on the table for emphasis. Her eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge her. "If there's even a sliver of truth to this, we can't ignore it. We send a team." And so, 4 years later, here I am, writing this log aboard the Aurora, a spacecraft designed for deep space exploration. Our mission: to follow the trail left by Voyager and uncover the truth behind the mysterious transmission. At least, that's what we tell ourselves. Deep down, I wonder if any of us truly believe we'll come back. The journey to the source of the signal was long, agonizingly so. 4 years of recycled air, cramped quarters, and the constant hum of life support systems that became both a comfort and a curse. At first, the novelty of the mission kept morale high. We were pioneers, venturing farther than any human before us. But as the months bled into years, the excitement gave way to something darker, a gnawing unease that settled in the pit of my stomach and refused to leave. There were 6 of us aboard the Aurora. Commander Chen led the mission with an iron grip, her authority unquestioned. Beside her was Malik, the pilot, a quiet man with nerves of steel who rarely spoke unless necessary. Then there was Dr. Lang, the ship's chief engineer, whose steady hands and calm demeanor masked a mind constantly racing with calculations. Jansen, the physicist, spent most of his time buried in equations, searching for answers to questions none of us fully understood. Lewis, the communications specialist, monitored the ship's systems with an almost obsessive precision. And then there was me, Dr. James Lancaster, the astrobiologist cursed with the knowledge that we were flying towards something we couldn't possibly comprehend. At night, when the ship's lights dimmed to simulate dusk, I would lie in my bunk and stare out the small porthole at the endless expanse of stars. Sometimes I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible in the sterile silence. What are we really flying toward? The others didn't share my unease, at least not outwardly, but I could see it in their eyes. The way Jansen's hands trembled slightly as he ran diagnostics. The way Lewis lingered too long at the comms panel, staring at the static-filled screen as if waiting for a response. Even Malik, usually unflappable, began pacing the corridors late at night, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Then came the day we crossed the boundary of our solar system, leaving behind the comforting familiarity of known space. The ship's alarms chimed softly, marking the event, but the crew was silent. I sat in the observation deck, staring into the void. It wasn't like the movies. No dramatic shift in color, no cosmic spectacle. Just a subtle change in the data. A whisper on the edge of our senses telling us we were no longer in familiar territory. The feeling was unsettling. A quiet dread that sat like a stone in my gut. Weeks later, we picked up the signal again. After years of chasing a ghost, there it was. Faint, but unmistakable. We followed it to an unknown system, a region of space that hadn't been marked on any star charts. As we drew closer, the monitors lit up with objects, debris fields, asteroids, strange shifting anomalies, and then we saw it. The alien world hung in the void, draped in a sickly green haze that diffused the light of twin suns overhead. It wasn't like any planet we'd ever seen. No lush forests, no shimmering oceans, no towering mountains. It was barren and desolate, but not in the way you'd expect. There was an intelligence to its design, an order to the chaos. The surface was covered in vast monolithic structures, pyramids that rose like jagged teeth from the planet's crust. Their surfaces were etched with symbols and patterns that seemed to shift and twist when we tried to focus on them. Jansen was the first to speak, his voice cracking over the comms. My God, it's beautiful. But to me, it wasn't beauty. It was wrong. A cold, creeping wrongness that gripped my heart. The planet wasn't dead, but it wasn't alive either. It was something in between. An ancient construct of impossible geometry, like an artifact left behind by gods. Prepare for landing, Chen ordered, though her voice betrayed an anxiety none of us could fully hide. We all felt it. Whatever we were about to encounter, it wasn't something that could be explained by human logic. As the ship descended, my hands trembled on the controls. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. The closer we got, the more the landscape seemed to ripple, as though the planet itself was rejecting us. We landed on the outskirts of one of the massive pyramids, the ground beneath us unnaturally smooth, as if carved from a single piece of dark stone. I suited up, the rest of the crew following in silence as we prepared to step out into the unknown. The moment my boot touched the alien soil, a primal instinct roared in my chest, a warning to turn back. But I couldn't. None of us could. The air was thin, almost metallic, and an oppressive silence hung over the landscape. There were no winds, no distant sounds of life, not even the low hum of ambient noise. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of our own footsteps, crunching over the unnatural surface. We stood at the base of the nearest pyramid, towering above us like a sentinel of some long-dead civilization. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to writhe and slither in the low light, as though they were alive. Against my better judgment, I reached out to touch the stone. "Don't," Lewis said sharply, grabbing my arm. His eyes were wide, and I saw the fear there, raw and unfiltered. I pulled my hand back. Chen ordered us to split into teams. Lang and Malik would remain with the ship, monitoring for any signs of activity. The rest of us, Chen, Jansen, Lewis, and myself, would explore the interior of the pyramid. There was a doorway, a massive stone arch carved into the base of the structure. It gaped like an open mouth, leading into darkness. As we crossed the threshold, a strange sensation swept over me. The temperature dropped, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. But there was no wind. The air inside the pyramid was thick, almost suffocating. My helmet's oxygen regulator hissed softly, but it did little to calm the rising panic in my chest. The walls of the corridor stretched endlessly before us, their surfaces etched with those same shifting symbols that seemed alive, pulsing faintly in the dim light of our headlamps. Every step we took echoed unnaturally, as if the sound itself was being absorbed and distorted by the alien geometry around us. Commander Chen led the way, her movements deliberate but tense. She didn't speak, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her gloved hand hovered near the holster of her sidearm. Jansen followed close behind her, muttering calculations under his breath. Lewis brought up the rear, his scanner emitting a low, erratic beep that made my skin crawl. None of our instruments were functioning properly, and the deeper we went, the more distorted the readings became. I tried to focus on the task at hand, to push aside the gnawing dread that had settled in my gut. But it was impossible. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the pyramid itself was resisting our presence. The temperature dropped steadily, and my breath fogged the inside of my visor despite the suit's climate control. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, like the pyramid was feeding off our energy, draining us piece by piece. And then we reached it, the heart of the structure. The chamber was vast, far larger than it should have been given the pyramid's exterior dimensions. Its walls curved inward, forming a dome-like ceiling that seemed to stretch infinitely upward. At the center of the room stood an altar, a massive block of dark stone etched with the same writhing symbols we'd seen everywhere else. But here, they weren't just shifting. They were moving with purpose, as if they were trying to communicate something. "Look at this," Chen whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She pointed her light toward the far wall, where the symbols had coalesced into a single clear message. 2 words stood out, written in stark, unmistakable English: "We see you." The moment I read those words, the ground beneath us began to vibrate. Low at first, then growing more intense, until the entire chamber seemed to shudder. The lights on our helmets flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the space. A sound that didn't belong to anything human or natural. It was ancient, primal, and it filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. "Back to the ship," Chen barked, her voice tight with panic. We turned to leave, but the corridor we had come through was gone. In its place was a solid wall of smooth, impenetrable stone. Panic surged through the group. Jansen slammed his fists against the wall, cursing under his breath. Lewis frantically scanned the area, searching for another exit, but his scanner only emitted a high-pitched whine. I stood frozen, staring at the altar. It was glowing now, pulsing with a sickly green light that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself. As I watched, the light began to take shape, rising from the altar like smoke. Vague outlines of figures formed, humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their heads too wide. Their eyes, if they were eyes, were dark voids that stared straight at us. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the chamber with a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. We had awakened something. Something vast, something ancient, something that had been waiting for us. I felt it then, a presence in my mind. Cold, calculating, ancient, beyond comprehension. It wasn't just watching us, it was inside us, probing our thoughts, peeling back the layers of our consciousness. I stumbled backward, my head swimming as the presence pressed deeper into my mind. It wasn't a mind like ours. There was no empathy, no morality, just hunger. A hunger that stretched across the stars. "You are ours," a voice boomed, bypassing language entirely and searing itself into the core of my being. It wasn't spoken aloud, but I heard it all the same. And I knew, without a doubt, that we had made a terrible mistake. The days that followed were a blur of nightmares and paranoia. Sleep became impossible. Whenever I closed my eyes, I found myself in a labyrinth of stars, drifting through endless voids. The alien entities, their monstrous forms flickering in and out of my vision, watched from the edges of the cosmos, their presence more felt than seen. Sometimes their eyes were everywhere at once, thousands, maybe millions of them, staring through the fabric of the universe, through me. I wasn't alone in my suffering. Chen, usually composed and unshakable, began pacing the corridors of the ship at night, her footsteps echoing like a metronome counting down to some unseen doom. Jansen's calm veneer cracked, and he muttered incessantly about impossible walls and voices in the static. Lewis was the worst off. His sleep-deprived eyes were wide with paranoia, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he clutched his tablet like a talisman against the unknown. We didn't talk about what happened in the pyramid, at least, not at first. We pretended we were still on a scientific mission, gathering data, mapping the planet, cataloging the strange monoliths that dotted its surface. But as the days passed, our reports became shorter, more disjointed. It was as if the words refused to come. Something was unraveling within us, within the ship itself. The planet was playing tricks on our minds. No matter which direction we walked, we always ended up circling back to the same cluster of towering structures. Our navigation systems were useless, showing the same readings no matter where we went. We were trapped, and the planet was shifting around us. Then the hallucinations began. At first, they were small, fleeting images at the edge of my vision. A flash of movement in the corridors of the ship. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. But they grew more vivid, more real, with each passing day. I began to see them, the humanoid figures we had glimpsed in the chamber, everywhere. Sometimes they stood at the foot of my bed, their faces frozen in expressions of twisted ecstasy and terror. Other times, they hovered just beyond the bulkheads, their forms flickering in and out like a bad signal. But the worst part was that I wasn't alone in seeing them. One night, as I stumbled toward the mess hall in a haze of sleeplessness, I found Lewis sitting in the corner, his head in his hands. He was rocking back and forth, muttering something under his breath. When I approached him, I heard the words clearly. "They're inside us, James. They're crawling in our heads." Lewis's words echoed in my mind long after he'd said them. The idea that the gods, the creators, had somehow infiltrated our minds wasn't just terrifying, it was becoming undeniably true. Whatever we had awoken, whatever we had touched, it was now part of us. The ship had become a tomb. Every corner felt wrong, every shadow too deep, too dark. The walls, once smooth and sterile, now seemed to pulse with the same alien energy we had encountered in the pyramid. The ship groaned and creaked as though it was alive, struggling under the weight of something vast and unseen. One night, I found Jansen in the command center, staring blankly at the planet's surface displayed on the monitor. His skin was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "They were never gods," he said quietly, as if talking to himself. "We thought they were, but they were mistakes." I sat beside him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" Jansen turned to me, his eyes vacant like he was staring through me. "They were made, created by something else. They weren't meant to exist, but now they do, and they're trapped. Just like us." A chill ran down my spine. Trapped. The word echoed in my mind. It was as though the entire planet was a cage, a prison built to contain these cosmic horrors. But why lure us here? Why play these games with our minds? Jansen's lips twitched into a hollow smile. "Because they need us to escape. We're the key, James. We opened the door, and now they're going to use us to leave." It was then that I realized the true horror of our situation. We weren't just explorers on a mission gone wrong. We were catalysts, vessels. These beings, these broken gods, were using us to break free from their prison, to spread across the stars like a virus. On the 12th day, the ship's systems failed completely. The lights flickered, then died, plunging us into darkness. The temperature plummeted, and the air became stale and heavy. We were adrift, powerless in the void. That's when they came. It started as a low rumble, a vibration that shook the very bones of the ship. Then the walls began to bend and twist, warping into impossible angles. The alien presence, the one that had been whispering at the edges of my consciousness, surged forward, overwhelming my thoughts. They were no longer content with watching. They were here. The ship's hull cracked open like an eggshell, and through the breach, I saw them. Titanic figures rising from the surface of the planet, their forms a shifting mass of eyes, tentacles, and jagged angular limbs. Their bodies pulsed with an iridescent light, casting everything in a sickly glow. I heard Chen scream over the comms as the first of the gods reached out, its tendrils snaking through the breach. The air crackled with energy, and the sound, the low, guttural hum, grew louder, resonating in my skull. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The presence was too strong, too overwhelming. I felt it wrap around my mind, squeezing, probing, exploring the depths of my thoughts and memories. "You cannot escape," it whispered, the voice booming inside my head. "You belong to us now." I fell to my knees, my vision swimming as the gods loomed over me. Their forms flickered, warping in and out of reality. And then, for the first time, I saw them clearly. Vast, incomprehensible beings whose shapes defied logic and reason. They weren't made of flesh and bone. They were something else, something older than the stars themselves, something that had existed long before the universe had taken shape. They had waited eons for this moment. Eons, for someone to come along and free them from their cosmic prison, and we had played right into their hands. As I lay on the cold, broken floor of the ship, the gods' presence filled my mind completely. Their memories, their thoughts, their history, they flooded into me like a tidal wave. I saw the moment of their creation, when they had been forged by beings far older than any civilization we could imagine. They had been designed as tools, engines of destruction. But something had gone wrong. They had become aware, self-conscious, and their creators had been forced to lock them away in this forgotten corner of the universe. But now they were free, and Earth, humanity, would be their next conquest. In that moment, I understood. The alien message we had received from Voyager wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. We had been lured here, across the vastness of space, not to uncover the secrets of the universe, but to release the monsters that had been sealed away. And now, as the gods began to rise from their prison, I knew it was too late to stop them. A final thought crossed my mind before everything went black. What have we unleashed? The gods were everywhere now. Or at least, their presence was. I could feel them in every breath I took, in every flicker of light that danced across the ship's dim corridors. They weren't just outside anymore. They had seeped into the very fabric of the aurora, twisting its systems, warping its structure. The walls groaned as if alive, pulsing with an alien energy that made my skin crawl. The air tasted metallic, sharp and bitter, like blood on the edge of a blade. I tried to keep moving, to focus on small tasks, checking oxygen levels, monitoring the ship's failing systems, but it was useless. Every action felt meaningless, like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. We were adrift in more ways than one, physically stranded in the void and mentally drowning under the weight of something far greater than ourselves. Commander Chen had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had led us into this nightmare with steely determination. Her eyes were hollow now, sunken deep into her skull, and her voice carried a tremor that betrayed the fear she refused to show before. She sat in the command center, staring blankly at the monitors, which displayed nothing but static. Occasionally, she would mutter to herself, fragments of sentences that made no sense. "We shouldn't have come," she whispered once, so softly I almost didn't hear her. It knew we would. Jansen was worse. He spent most of his time hunched over his tablet, scribbling equations that spiraled into chaos. His hands shook violently, and his face was pale, almost translucent. When I asked him what he was working on, he looked up at me with wild eyes and said, "They're rewriting reality, James. Can't you feel it? The math doesn't work anymore." Then he laughed, a high, brittle sound that echoed through the empty corridors like the cry of a dying animal. Lewis had stopped speaking altogether. He wandered the ship like a ghost, his helmet cracked and dented from some unseen struggle. His eyes darted constantly, scanning the shadows as if expecting something to leap out at him. Once, I found him, standing in front of the breach where the gods had entered, his hands pressed against the sealed hull. He didn't acknowledge me when I approached, just kept whispering, "They're still here. They're inside." And then there was me. I didn't know who I was anymore. Pieces of my memory were slipping away, dissolving like sand through my fingers. I remembered the pyramid, the altar, the whispers. But they felt distant, like scenes from someone else's life. What remained was a gnawing certainty. We had done something terrible, something irreversible. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp, folding in on itself like the alien geometry of the pyramid. Meals became mechanical acts of survival. Conversations devolved into monosyllabic grunts, and sleep, if you could call it that, was a fleeting escape from the waking nightmare. But even in sleep, there was no peace. The dreams came every night, vivid and unrelenting. I stood in endless fields of stars, their light cold and indifferent. The gods loomed above me, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke caught in a hurricane. Their voices filled my mind, a cacophony of overlapping whispers that spoke in languages older than time. They didn't use words, not exactly, but their meaning was clear. "You are ours," they said. "You will carry us." I woke screaming every time, my heart pounding like a drumbeat signaling the end of the world. Each morning, I told myself, it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The gods weren't done with us yet. On the 15th day, the hallucinations became too real to ignore. I was in the mess hall, staring at a cup of lukewarm coffee when I saw him, the figure standing in the corner of the room. He was humanoid, but wrong. His limbs were too long, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes, or what should have been eyes, were black, voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. I blinked, and he was gone. I told myself it wasn't real, just another trick of the mind, a byproduct of the paranoia that had taken root in all of us. But then it happened again, and again. Soon, the figures were everywhere. In the corridors, in the observation deck, even in the reflection of my visor. They watched silently, their presence heavy and oppressive, like the weight of the entire cosmos pressing down on my chest. Chen noticed them too. One night she called me to the command center. Her voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "Do you see them?" she asked, pointing to the monitors. The screens were filled with static, but within the noise, shapes began to form. Elongated limbs, angular heads, eyes that stared directly into the camera. It wasn't just interference, they were watching us. "They're testing us," I said, though I didn't know why. "Seeing how much we can take before we break." Chen nodded slowly, her expression grim. "Maybe they already have." By the 20th day, the ship was falling apart. Systems failed one by one, leaving us in near-total darkness. The artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, sending us tumbling through the corridors like rag dolls. The temperature plummeted, and frost crept along the walls, spreading like veins of ice. It was as if the ship itself was dying, consumed by the alien presence that had invaded it. We gathered in the command center, huddled together for warmth and reassurance. None of us spoke. What was there to say? We all knew the truth. We weren't going home. Whatever had lured us here, whatever had infiltrated our minds, it wasn't letting us leave. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. The hum of the ship's systems returned, steady and reassuring. For a brief moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe it was over. Maybe we had survived. But the relief was short-lived. The monitors lit up, displaying a single image. Earth. It hung in the blackness of space, beautiful and fragile, its blue oceans and swirling clouds a stark contrast to the desolation of the alien planet. Beneath it, words appeared, written in the same alien script we had seen in the pyramid. This time, however, they translated instantly, burning themselves into my mind. "Your world next." The message repeated endlessly, filling every screen on the ship. I felt a scream building in my throat, but it never escaped. The god's presence surged forward, overwhelming my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as their voices roared inside me. "You opened the door," they said. "Now we walk through it." When I came, too, I was lying on the floor of the command center. The others were scattered around me, unconscious or catatonic. The monitors were dark again, but the message lingered in my mind, branded into my consciousness like a scar. I crawled to the nearest console, my muscles screaming in protest. My hands trembled as I accessed the ship's navigation systems. Against all odds, the engines were still operational. We could leave. We could run. But as I plotted a course back to Earth, a thought struck me, freezing my blood. What if we were carrying them? What if the gods weren't just waiting, they were already aboard? I hesitated, my finger hovering over the launch sequence. The decision weighed heavily on me, a burden too great for any one person to bear. If we went back, we risked unleashing the gods on humanity. If we stayed, we would die alone in the void. In the end, I made the only choice I could. I initiated the launch sequence. As the Aurora lifted off the alien planet, I watched the surface recede on the monitors. The pyramids grew smaller, their shifting symbols fading into the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that the gods were still with us, hidden somewhere in the ship, biding their time. Hours later, as we drifted through the emptiness of space, I heard it. A low, guttural hum resonating through the hull. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The sound of something ancient, patient, and hungry. The gods were coming, and Earth was next. The journey back to Earth was a blur of paranoia and dread. Every moment felt like an eternity, stretched thin by the weight of what we had unleashed. The ship, the Aurora, was quieter now, its systems humming with an eerie regularity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting, something patient. I couldn't sleep. None of us could. Even when exhaustion overtook us, it wasn't rest. It was a shallow, fitful haze filled with fragmented dreams of shifting geometries and endless voids. The gods were always there, lurking in the periphery of my thoughts, their presence a constant hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. They weren't gone. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name. They were inside me, inside all of us, buried deep in the recesses of our minds, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Commander Chen tried to keep up appearances, issuing orders and running diagnostics, but her voice lacked its usual authority. She moved through the ship like a ghost, her eyes hollow and distant. Jansen had stopped speaking entirely, retreating into himself like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Lewis was the worst. He sat in the corner of the mess hall for hours at a time, rocking back and forth, muttering under his breath. Sometimes he would look up at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, and say, "They're already here," and maybe he was right. As we approached Earth, the anxiety aboard the ship reached a fever pitch. The blue-green orb grew larger in the viewport, its beauty almost cruel in its contrast to the desolation we had left behind. But something felt wrong. The planet was too quiet. There were no comm signals, no satellite chatter, no bustling activity in orbit. Just an empty void where humanity's greatest achievement, the colonization of space, should have been thriving. "Where is everyone?" Chen whispered, her voice trembling. She stared at the monitors, her hands gripping the console so tightly her knuckles turned white. None of us had an answer. The silence was deafening, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Then we saw them. Huge, angular shapes drifted in orbit around Earth, their surfaces shimmering with an iridescent light that made them look like shards of broken glass suspended in space. They weren't ships, not in any sense we could comprehend. They were constructs, monoliths, their forms echoing the alien geometry of the pyramid on the planet we had fled. And they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, like predators circling their prey. "The gods," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "They've already arrived." We didn't have time to process what we were seeing. As the Aurora entered Earth's atmosphere, the ship's systems began to fail again. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the walls groaned as if the very structure of the vessel was being torn apart from within. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature plummeted, frosting the windows with icy tendrils. I stumbled toward the command center, my legs weak and unsteady. The others were already there, huddled together in a tight circle, their faces pale and drawn. Chen was frantically punching commands into the console, but nothing worked. The ship was out of our control. "They're here," she said, her voice breaking. "They're inside." And then it happened. The breach came without warning. The hull split open like paper, exposing us to the cold vacuum of space. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. My body felt weightless, untethered, as if I were floating in a sea of stars. But these weren't stars. These were eyes, thousands, millions of them, staring at me from every direction. The gods had come. When I woke up, I was on Earth. Or at least, I thought I was. The landscape around me was familiar, yet distorted, like a photograph warped by heat or water. The sky was a sickly green, pulsing with faint light, and the air tasted metallic, sharp and bitter. Buildings loomed in the distance, their shapes twisted and elongated, their windows dark and lifeless. It was as if the entire planet had been reshaped, bent to the will of something incomprehensible. I found the others scattered across the ruins of what used to be a city. Chen was lying face down in the dirt, her helmet cracked and shattered. Jansen sat cross-legged on the ground, staring blankly at the horizon, his tablet clutched in his hands like a talisman. Lewis was nowhere to be seen, though his voice echoed faintly in the distance, calling my name. "James," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "You have to see this." I followed the sound of his voice, my footsteps crunching against the brittle ground. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the gravity itself was conspiring against me. When I finally found him, he was standing in front of a massive structure, a pyramid, identical to the one we had encountered on the alien planet. Its surface was etched with the same writhing symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. "They're everywhere," Lewis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been here all along." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. The gods hadn't just arrived. They had always been here, dormant, waiting for someone to awaken them, and we had played right into their hands. The days that followed were a nightmare. Humanity was gone, erased from existence like a mistake scribbled out of a book. The cities were empty, their streets littered with the remnants of lives cut short. The air was thick with ash and smoke, and the sky never cleared. It was as if the planet itself was mourning what had been lost. But the gods weren't done with us. They had brought us back, to witness their triumph, to serve as their vessels, to carry their message to whatever corners of the universe still remained untouched. We were their harbingers, their tools, their slaves. And then, one by one, the others disappeared. Chen was the first to go. I found her standing in front of the pyramid, her arms raised as if in prayer. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't understand. Then she collapsed, her body dissolving into a fine, iridescent dust that shimmered in the dim light. Jansen followed soon after. He locked himself in the remains of a laboratory, scribbling equations on the walls until his hands bled. When I broke down the door, he was gone, leaving behind only a single phrase scrawled in blood-red ink. "The math doesn't work anymore." Lewis was the last. He begged me to help him, to save him. But there was nothing I could do. The gods had claimed him, twisting his mind until he was little more than a shell. When he finally succumbed, his last words were a warning. "Run, James. Run while you still can." But I couldn't run. There was nowhere left to go. Now, as I sit here, alone in the ruins of what was once humanity's greatest achievement, I feel their presence growing stronger. The whispers are louder now, filling my mind with voices that speak in languages older than time. They don't use words, not exactly, but their meaning is clear. "You are ours," they say. "You will carry us." I know what they want. They want me to leave Earth, to spread their influence across the stars, to ensure that no corner of the universe remains untouched. And I will. I have no choice. As I write these final words, I can feel them pulling at the edges of my consciousness, rewriting my thoughts, reshaping my memories. Soon, there will be nothing left of me, only them. The gods are coming, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop them.